Welcome to Monday Scoop. I'm Georgia Raisman, and on Monday Scoop, I have short conversations with a variety of experts on issues affecting people over age 55. Whether it's food, health, style, or entertainment, we'll explore ways to lead better and deeper lives as we get older. Hi, I'm Georgia Raisman, and this is Monday Scoop. Today, I have with me Julia Lindner, who is the Executive Director of ACKNow. ACKNow is an organization dedicated to improving the quality of life on Nantucket. And she's going to give us a little more specific information about what that means, and also let us know how she got here and what ACKNow is all about. And then we're going to turn our focus to short-term rentals, which is, as you know, the opportunity to talk about platforms like Airbnb, VRBO, and HomeAway, and how they affect a specific quality of life in many of our communities having to do with housing. But Julia, first tell me about yourself. How did you get here, and what is your background?
Well, thank you, Georgia, for having me today. I landed on Nantucket in 2005 for the first time. My husband was actually in the building trades in the late 90s and wanted to come back, find a way to come back to this beautiful place. And he endeavored to buy a summer house in Nantucket. First looking at the houses that were falling into the ocean and on Sheep's Pond. Mm-hmm. Got deterred from that, thankfully. But we've had a home out in Nantucket since then. And so at first it was a summer house. We lived in Boston. And then in 2008, we moved full-time with our two very small children. Actually, my second born was born here at the hospital.
Oh, good. So yeah. You're not all wash-ashores. Excuse me.
No,
one of you is an actual native-born Nantucketer.
One of us has a brick, yes, at the hospital. Sandy and Tommy were raised in Nantucket with the family, and we were there for about 8 years, year-round. I worked at the new school. I worked for the town as the budget director and financial analyst, if you like. So that gave me a lot of exposure into my new role at ACKNow.
And is your background one in economics and finance?
Mm-hmm. In finance, yes. I started out in investment banking and did some currency sales and trading in Boston until moving to Nantucket. Yes.
Well, I noticed in reading about all of this that I gathered in reading about all this that you have an acute understanding of what the economic factors are that are at work in connection with short-term rental platforms and how they affect local economies. And what I learned about all this is the obvious arguments are in favor of them, that anybody who owns a house and wants to rent it out for a couple of weeks manages to make a fair amount of money from those short-term rentals. And the arguments are that those people can then afford their mortgages, they can afford extra things, and maybe even in this era of pandemics, they can afford to survive when people are not working and not making as much as they might make. So against that, the arguments are, well, but local housing is going up. I mean, the price of local houses are going up because people want to buy them just for that purpose. Is that what you're finding here and elsewhere? Or how do you see that?
I think you definitely highlight sort of this conundrum that's caused by these big platforms that have come about since pretty much in the last 10 years. Airbnb was founded
2010.
Right, exactly. Just 10 years ago. It feels like a lifetime at this point because it's entrenched in our culture. But worldwide, it's had a really big impact. Now, yes, it's been great for homeowners to have maybe a little bit of side income in terms of renting out a room or renting out their property for maybe a couple of weeks during the year. But to your point, it's also created this new generation, literally a new business venture for folks saying, where should I invest my money? Let's look at the United States. Where should I invest? Is it Hartford? Is it Minneapolis? Is it a beach town? Where am I going to start my own Airbnb business? And
so that's not local anymore.
No.
And that, I think, is something we see here. And I think many vacation communities are seeing that where there are people who are completely uninterested in the community that they're in. They're simply interested in it as an investment opportunity. And the neighborhood in which they happen to buy a house and perhaps becomes a party house where they're putting up 10 or 15 people in neighborhoods that otherwise used to be where people knew their neighbors from day to day and week to week, are now becoming neighborhoods that have small hotels in them, which alters the character of the neighborhood, and it doesn't interest the off-island or out of community owner from wherever they happen to be, because they could care less about that community. What's interesting is that they're two different. The people who are benefited are not the same people who are damaged. That's what's interesting, because the people who are benefited, the homeowners, are one group. The people who are injured is the community at large, and that's not getting the better housing they should get. That's having their housing prices go up and their rentals be unavailable.
Yeah, and so the first communities that saw the major impact on the housing supply were the cities, right? So the Bostons and the San Franciscos and New Orleans, they've all dealt with this. Mostly because they have a hotel district. So they can say to visitors, you just go to the hotel. A lot of them have said, if you own a home in our city, you can still rent your home part-time, because we do want to enable home ownership and we want to make it easier for people to afford to live in the cities. But if you want to come in as an outsider and just invest with the only reason is to profit from this business, then we won't welcome you. Now that's very cut and dry. And Nantucket is a very different place. So obviously resort communities have dealt with short-term rentals in very different ways, let's say, than the cities. For example, they might decide that they want them in certain areas because they already have commercial activity in certain areas, and they say they're effectively a commercial activity. We want to keep them in these places. They've put on caps on the number of them to decide, well, they should only represent a certain percentage of the housing supply. So on the island, we have about 20% of our housing inventory that's short-term rental, registered as a short-term rental. So you might say, okay, we'll cap it at 25, or so different places have done different things. And I'd say, it's an area where too complicated is not great. New Orleans is probably an example of that. And I think it is challenging to figure out a very thoughtful solution, but you have to try.
Yeah, especially in places like Massachusetts, where we also have a housing law 40B, that means that if we do not have enough affordable housing, we are then open to the possibility of developers coming in and putting in developments that are not subject to local regulation by zoning boards, or like by local organizations that normally have a lot of input into what the building density should be, what the building should look like. And you get a lot of building densities that are not acceptable to year-round residents, but we can't appeal it because 40B says these developers are allowed to do it regardless of what locals think of it, because there is not enough affordable housing. So if the short-term rental platforms are taking away more affordable housing opportunities, then you're handing over more and more of your local housing supply to essentially off-island or out of neighborhood suppliers, and that's at the detriment of people who live here year-round, the firemen, the teachers, the nurses, the people who you really need to keep your neighborhood and your community vibrant.
Right. That's effectively the bottom line. So the way I look at it is, I see, there's a gap between what a year-round person can afford for a house and what an investor is willing to pay based on what amount of money they can make renting it.
And that's probably a very large gap.
And it's growing. That's the real issue. So when folks say, well, can't we incentivize homeowners to maybe turn their back cottage into a year-round rental? Can't we incentivize even an investor to say, well, rent year-round? We would have to throw a lot of money at that person. So we can't change the tax code, right? Because it is very advantageous to call yourself an active short-term rental business, and you have a tremendous amount of offsets on your tax return that mean that it's not just the rental income, it's what you can deduct, and it's the depreciation on the property, and it's the taxes you avoid giving to the federal government. So knowing we can't change the tax code, and knowing that there are just so many things we can do. We look at what we actually have tools for, and we have a set of tools that the Baker administration has handed over to communities in Massachusetts.
You'll have to tell me about that, because I was looking at the New Orleans statute, which is pretty specific and pretty complicated, and I mean, it does allow an exemption for a homeowner, and it does attempt to regulate the platforms by saying you have to delete your illegal listings, and you have to allow, you have to impose some sort of a rule on your local owners who are using this platform, so that they will not discriminate illegally. And you have to give us a 20% or whatever the fee is that will go towards local housing funding. But it gets awfully complicated, and then you have an enforcement issue. So what do you think that smaller communities like ours, and like maybe Vail, Colorado, or other resort communities can do by way of addressing these issues?
No, I think you're right that too complicated is, the example is New Orleans, and it's made enforcement a real big challenge. So generally speaking, when you look at resort communities like ours, I think that you can find that you can easily draw lines between two buckets. So a house that is used as a primary residence and a house that is used as an investment, as a business rental, right? Then you have sort of the in-between uses, right? Folks who may not live in their home as a primary residence, but they may want to offset some of their costs. So you have to sort of draw a line somewhere in those circles. So you might say that, for example, if you live in the home, if the house is used as a residence, right, for X amount of days a year, then perhaps you could rent, you'd have access to a certain number of days of rental, and maybe you would make a second set of rules for the other group. Some communities have gone that route. And so with what Massachusetts has given us for tools, it is customizable to a degree that is beyond, I think, most people's comprehension.
Is that good or bad? So what has Massachusetts given us that's so customizable?
Generally speaking, they say you can put in a registry, which is pretty much the basis of any bylaw that you're going to go for, because if you don't know which ones are rentals, right, then you have to start there. So the registry is the first step. And oftentimes you might have like a caretaker on file, so that if the town runs into issues with a property, they know who to call. If the renters run into issues, they know where to call, because right now our Board of Health and our police really get those calls. So that's unfortunate. So, and then you go into whether it's the owner-occupied versus non-owner-occupied, whether it's zones where you might have them or not have them, that's really a licensing scheme, if you like, that can be drawn up in a lot of different ways.
So you could then say, for example, here on Nantucket, if you're in a zone that is otherwise residential, you can't have anything other than an owner-occupied.
That's
unit.
a possibility for any community in Massachusetts.
So it could be tailored fairly carefully.
Absolutely. So, but you can understand that a lot of suburbs, for example, don't want these at all, right? So they've gone ahead and said, we just want to outlaw them, period, because we have hotels near the highways, and you can go there, right?
Yeah.
And so Boston's saying, well, we don't want to welcome investor-owned at all, because again, we have the hotel infrastructure. We have a very strong tradition of renting our own homes here. And so it's a delicate approach that has to be taken, one that you have to think about all the unintended consequences, and make sure that this tradition can keep on going.
So on a local level, we're doing this via town meeting articles, and of course, in the era of COVID, we don't know when our next town meeting is going to. Theoretically, it's going to be next April, and you had town meeting articles ready for the special town meeting this fall.
We did. I mean, like many others, there were 56 sponsored articles, citizen-sponsored articles this year, which is a record, I think. So to your point, it is, COVID has just thrown a wrench into everybody's plans in terms of town meeting.
It's interesting that it's also thrown a wrench into a lot of short-term rentals. So because there's not as much travel, although they found that before COVID, short-term rentals were accelerating over-tourism. People have been talking about over-tourism since everyone has gotten so prosperous before COVID around the world, that people have been over-touring Venice and Barcelona and these places that were always popular to go to, and then now with the opportunity to go there on a short-term rental basis and say in somebody's apartment or local house, you were getting way too many tourists. And I guess I'm sure that might also potentially be an issue at smaller places like ours. Now with COVID, the over-tourism isn't an issue. And in theory, you might see some people going back to, well, maybe I'll stick to a year-round rental rather than do short-term because at least it's more reliable. I mean, have you heard any of that around here, or are people still holding off and waiting for COVID to be dealt with?
I think you're right that we saw a few early on. And of course, this is anecdotal information because when it comes to long-term rentals, year-round rentals, we don't have real data about this. Yeah. But I think that there were some homeowners who decided, I want to make sure my season isn't completely, just taken from under me. So I will go ahead and rent a year-round. But you definitely, when it comes to those pure rental houses, you definitely saw, I think we saw a surge in that market. So the folks who were renting their own homes and part of their home, that was a market that was, I think, down this year. Mm-hmm. But whole house, pure rental, they did, I think, very well. Mm-hmm. My understanding is we might even have hit our weekly record on how much we rented a house this year. Mm-hmm.
And I guess when you consider the year-round rental issues, then you come up against the fact that many states and cities have very favorable tenant-oriented laws for, and which can make it difficult to get rid of tenants if they happen to be unruly or difficult or non-paying or damaging. And it's difficult to talk about that because most tenants are not, and I don't have what the statistics are, but I would guess that the overwhelming number of tenants are compliant and responsible. But there is a subgroup of tenants who are not responsible or not compliant, and they may turn your landlord group off completely from the idea of renting. Mm. And I'm sure that group of landlords is going to say, I don't want to take any risks. I had this tenant who did terrible damage, and I had $40,000 worth of damage, and my insurance company is furious at me. And why should I do that when I can just put it on a short-term market rental and nobody's going to do much damage over a weekend?
Mm. I think that you're right. It varies from, I think, owner to owner what their experience has been. Mm-hmm. But overall, I think the theme is that, the investor-owned short-term rental is never going to be a year-round rental. So it's taking away, in some cases, not in all cases, obviously some of those homes are multi-million-dollar homes, but what we're finding is that the investors are moving into year-round neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. And so if maybe, I wasn't around when Pilgrim Road was a year-round neighborhood, but at some point it was. Yeah. And so today it's a vacation rental street. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happening in some of the other areas. So when you look at Somerset Road, when you look at 3M, when you look at Cato Lane, mm-hmm. and you say, oh, wow, this is changing. Yeah,
and I think if I were a resident there, I would be very, very angry to feel that what I had moved into as a residential neighborhood with kids playing is now somehow or other become a neighborhood of transients and people moving in and out whom I have no idea who they are and how long they're here.
I don't think it's what they bought into.
No, it's not what they bought into,
No.
and it's not fair to have it imposed on them by people who used to think of as neighbors. When their house is now maybe not owned by that same person anymore, especially if it's not owned by anyone who has any vested interest in this community and this neighborhood and this island. Mm. It's a very difficult situation. So where do you see solutions coming from?
Well, from our perspective, from ACKNow's perspective, we've been spending weeks, if not months, looking at what a bylaw could look like mm-hmm. in terms of Nantucket. And we have a short window to present it to the community and to the town to get some feedback, and then going to town meeting. Citizen-sponsored articles are due mid-November.
And are you getting feedback? Do you find you're hearing from the community at a serious level, or just anecdotally?
No, I think we've been looking for feedback. So we've been going to get the feedback, mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, like you say, COVID has made things rather difficult to mm-hmm. have any sort of public dialogue.
Mm. How do you do education and outreach under these conditions right now?
I think you use social media, unfortunately, or fortunately, if you like to say, definitely through our subscriber base. And word of mouth is great. but it's, it's hard to hit everybody.
Yeah,
right?
and you can't conduct very many meetings, especially now as the weather gets colder. You can't conduct very many outdoor meetings with socially distanced homeowners.
No, I know. It's absolutely, I hope that the town will think outside the box in terms of town meeting, because at some point we're going to want to talk about serious issues that we've pushed off. And I know some towns have done, drive-in styles and, but we have a pretty large, even though we don't have a large percentage of our voter group going to town meeting, we still have 500 people who go to town meeting every year. So.
Yeah, and then of course the thing is that the Monday Scoop is directed mostly at people over 55. And that demographic, number one, there may be more people, maybe not at the 55 end of it, but at the upper end of it, who are a little more nervous about going to meetings in person. And a little more nervous about voting in person. And there's that issue of how do you reach those people. At the same time, they may be people who have those ancillary apartments or ancillary buildings, or even room enough on their property to create a covenant house or some other kind of housing that could be used for local housing needs in lieu of using it on an Airbnb platform. So trying to reach those people, maybe presentations at Sherburne Commons when that can happen, or at a local senior center, either virtually or in person when we can meet in person again, might be an outreach opportunity.
I agree. We have to do all that we can.
Yeah.
And think differently than we used to.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to thank you for coming today. It was really nice of you, Julia, to take the time out of your schedule, and I want to wish you the best in this outreach issue, because I think it's very important that we retain control of our housing here in Nantucket, which has gotten way out of reach for people in the middle class, as we know, and has made us subject to 40B type housing of the magnitude and scale that we really don't want to see. And I think your ACKNow and groups like it are very helpful in bringing the dangers of those things to bubbling up to the consciousness of your typical Nantucket voter. And it's unfortunate that it's sort of group against group, because it's certainly an income-producing opportunity for a lot of people, and certainly a lot of people on Nantucket need that extra income. But the overall cost to the community, including those same people, has got to be made clear over time, and I think your group is helping to make those issues clearer.
Thank you.
So thank you for sharing all of that time with me, and I wish you lots of luck in getting that message out.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for being with me today, and I look forward to the next episode of Monday Scoop. Are there topics you'd like to know more about? Email me at mondayscoop@gmail.com. See you next Monday.